You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. To hear the latest episode, just say, play the news from The Australian.
From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Claire Harvey. It's Thursday, July 4. An epidemic of diabetes threatens to send Australia's life expectancy rate into reverse. That's the finding of a parliamentary health committee, which has found 70% of adults in some communities have type 2 diabetes. Religious groups, the Coalition and the Greens have found something in common. They all want to know if Anthony Albanese will deliver on long-promised reforms to religious discrimination laws. That story's live now at theaustralian.com.au. Will Joe Biden step aside? And could he really hand the presidency to Kamala Harris? Today, our chief international correspondent, Cameron Stewart, sorts the panic from the probabilities. It's the 4th of July in the United States, the 248th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But as Americans gather for hot dogs and fireworks, like Macy's famous New York Spectacular, their glorious democracy looks a little tatty. With mounting speculation, President Joe Biden will step aside to avoid handing the country back to Donald Trump.
Drip by drip, more Democrats seem to be getting cold feet over President Biden's re-election campaign after that disastrous...
Quote, a large and increasing group of House Democrats concerned about the president's candidacy.
As Biden's own team digs in.
He understands that he's not a young man, obviously. He said this. But his focus is going to continue to deliver for the American people.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. Cameron, for a long time in US politics, we've had people engaging in wishful thinking. Will this be the end of Donald Trump? Is this a turning point for this or that campaign? And now we're at a moment where a lot of people are talking about Joe Biden potentially pulling out of this presidential race after his disastrous debate performance. Is this more wishful thinking or is this real?
I think this is more than wishful thinking. I think this is really a tipping point in American politics in a way that we haven't seen before. There was such alarm within Democrat ranks about Joe Biden's performance that some people are now coming out publicly, Democrat congressmen, and calling on him to step aside. The liberal-leaning US media, which have been very, very supportive of Joe Biden all the way through, calling on him to either go, in the case of the New York Times, or reconsider his position in the case of the Washington Post. That is very big stuff from the Democrat side. You've got old campaign strategists like James Carville, who managed Bill Clinton's 1992 election campaign, calling on Biden to step aside. These are very big voices.
Give the people what they want. Vox populi. They want something different.
And so it's far more than just a politics as usual, it was a bad week kind of attitude, which is what Joe Biden's camp is really saying. The heavy hitters in the Democratic Party, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, have come out publicly and backed Joe Biden. Nancy Pelosi has been a little less enthusiastic, but nevertheless has still backed him.
He has a bad night. Now, again, I think it's a legitimate question to say, is this an episode or is this a condition?
And you'd expect that. And of course, the White House team is saying, look, it was a bad day. He had jet lag, he had a cold. Depending on what day it is, they've got a different excuse. But the bottom line, Claire, is that 50 million Americans saw this performance. And any Australians who saw it would see with their own eyes how much of a decline Joe Biden has suffered over the past 4 years.
With dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if We finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's
And I think this is really a very serious issue. I don't think it is something that will just come and go. I think the Democratic Party are really seriously considering whether Joe Biden will step up and be the contender or whether he should step aside.
There was a lot of criticism that Joe Biden was too old when he first ran for the presidency in 2020, Cam. But when you look back at the 2020 debates that he had with Donald Trump,
This is the guy who's tried to cut Medicare. So the idea that Donald Trump is lecturing me on Social Security and Medicare? Come on.
He tried to get rid of. He
Mr.
tried to
President,
hurt
and then I
Social
have to go to
Security
another
years ago.
he seemed like a fairly robust, quite normal, chatty 77-year-old, a year younger, incidentally, than Donald Trump is now. What do you think about that? Did they make a mistake in choosing him in the first place? Was he too old back in 2020?
No, I definitely don't think he was. He was, as you say, a much more robust performer. He has declined very much in office, as some people simply do at that age. He was the perfect candidate almost for Donald Trump because Trump, of course, is famously erratic and volatile, and he'd had a very volatile presidency. And Americans were just looking for someone calm, experienced, and, boring even, really. And he did beat Donald Trump fairly convincingly. And for Joe Biden, that's been a massive matter of pride, the fact that he was the one who got rid of Donald Trump. He's a Democrat hero. But now he faces the very galling prospect for him of staying too long and actually being the one potentially, if he miscalculates here, who delivers the White House back to Donald Trump.
There has never been a president who's stood aside or resigned because of illness, but there have been presidents who've had serious things happen to them and serious disabilities that they've lived with while in office. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic president in the 19-teens, suffered a stroke while in office and then didn't stand at the next election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt suffered polio and was quite severely disabled, but this was concealed from the American public because he wanted to project an image of being physically robust. How significant would it be if Joe Biden really did admit that he is incapacitated now?
It would be huge, really. Joe Biden, understandably, is a very proud man. It's not really like him to step aside, so I think it would be a massive decision on his part to do so, firstly. Secondly, think of the timing here. We've only got 4 months till the presidential election. I don't think any president has stood aside so close to an actual election. And it's for aging/mental health reasons that he would be stepping aside again. We haven't seen that again in a presidency. I think it would be very humbling for Joe Biden to feel he had to step aside at this minute. But politics changes so quickly here, Claire. At the moment, I think you can say it's a very finely balanced debate as to whether Joe Biden stays. Certainly the mainstream of the Democratic Party are trying to persuade people that he will stay. Joe Biden and his family seem to want him to stay. But politics can change so quickly here. I think all we need to see is a couple of opinion polls that see that Joe Biden has plummeted in the fight against Donald Trump, and I think you will see the Democratic Party suddenly develop far sharper teeth overnight.
So what happens if that is the case? Does it fall to Kamala Harris?
That's a great question. The general consensus thinking would be that Joe Biden would effectively say, I'm not running again, and he'd throw the field open. What he would do is he'd release the convention candidates who are supposed to vote for him at the party's convention in August, and there would be an open contest between whoever wanted to contest the ballot. But that may not be the case. He may, for example, say, I'm stepping aside, but I put my support behind my vice president, Kamala Harris. He could even do something radical, as in resign the presidency and give the presidency to Kamala Harris.
What's your take on Kamala Harris? She's widely mocked from the right of politics.
And here she is rewriting the history about this is her being an empowered woman.
Don't ever carry as a personal burden your capacity to do whatever you dream and aspire to do based on other people's limited ability to see who can do what.
She kind of seems to tick quite a lot of woke boxes. Is she as much of a dud as she's made out to be?
Look, that's a good question. I think she's got some fairly unfair press as vice president because vice presidents don't really do much. They're never really particularly good or particularly bad. Frankly, it's very hard to define their role. However, we should remember that Kamala Harris was a very poor campaigner in 2020.
I'm not a billionaire. I can't fund my own campaign. And as the campaign has gone on, it has become harder and harder to raise the money we need to compete.
The other thing about Kamala Harris is, while she's very accomplished, she's not a popular person in the Midwest. And the key states in the Midwest, the big city Democrats in America love Kamala because she's a woman of color, very highly achieved, a prosecutor, etc., etc. They're the reasons that the people in the Midwest, a lot of voters, don't particularly like her.
So, if not Kamala, then who?
There are two standouts. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. He's very popular in California. He's straight from Central Casting with straight white teeth. He's the old-style candidate, if you like.
You don't turn your back. You go home with the one that brought you to the dance. 100%, all in.
I think the Democrats would have a bit of a problem, given their ethos, to be replacing a woman of colour with a white male from the same state. I think that would be a tricky one for them to argue. The other one is Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan. She's a really tough cookie.
None of what she just said is true. And here's why you can't trust anything she's saying when it comes to reproductive rights.
She's stood up against a lot of the Trump extremists, if you like, in her state. She was under a kidnap plot at one stage. She's very popular in Michigan, which of course is a key swing state. She might be quite a good contender. The person, when I was travelling through the Midwest covering the election last time, who impressed me the most was Pete Buttigieg, who is the transport minister.
Joe Biden's presidency has been among the most productive and successful in American history.
I think he would be a strong candidate as well. The issue for him might be he is gay, and will the American electorate, especially African Americans, be okay with that?
You were in the United States as our correspondent for the rise and then the fall, even if it's not a permanent fall, of Donald Trump in 2020. What's your sense in your waters now, Cam? Do you feel like the momentum is on for Trump? He seems like a much more disciplined performer, certainly judging by that last debate now.
Well, that was one of Trump's best performances because he didn't lose his temper, he didn't rant and rave, he kept himself quite composed. The question for Donald Trump is, can he win the middle ground that he lost in 2020? And again in those midterms as well, he lost them there. At this point in time, his biggest advantage is simply the disarray within the Democrats over Biden, etc. He might be the Steve Bradbury kind of presidential winner here. The Democrats just fall over amongst themselves because they don't know who should actually lead the party to the next election. So I think that's Donald Trump's biggest chance.
Coming up, is Donald Trump on a winning streak? There's a UK election in the offing too, with voters likely to sweep the Tories from power. We'll have all the latest live, night and day at theaustralian.com.au. And we'll be back in just a moment. Cameron, Donald Trump's had two significant wins in the past 2 days. One is that his sentencing over his conviction for hush money payments has been delayed until September. The other is that the US Supreme Court has found in the broad that presidents can't be held accountable for acts that they committed while in office. What's your sense of those two rulings and what they'll mean for Trump?
Well, they're both good news for Donald Trump. The delay in the sentencing for his hush money trial is good and bad in the sense that it's a relief for him that he won't potentially be jailed for the actual Republican convention, which is only in about 2 weeks' time. And the sentencing was going to happen about 4 days before that actual convention. That's been delayed till September, but then, of course, that does mean that's quite close to the election, so there is a potential for that to backfire. The other one, of course, is the Supreme Court ruling. Basically, it's a fairly mixed ruling, but it says that the president is entitled to a presumptive immunity for prosecution for his official acts, as opposed to his unofficial acts. This does make it more difficult to prosecute a president for the acts that he took in office. So that definitely helps Donald Trump. It's not a blanket ruling. Certainly, he could still be prosecuted for the so-called unofficial acts, but you can imagine the sort of legal arguments that would go on to determine which is official and which is unofficial. The big picture here, Claire, is that with every single month that goes on, Donald Trump's various trials that are coming up either get delayed or changed, or aspects of them get altered. And it is increasingly unlikely, I think, that any of his legal issues will actually really be an impediment to him running for president in November and potentially winning.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. If Joe Biden does throw in the towel, the Australian subscribers will be the first to know. Join us at theaustralian.com.au.